a full-frame 85 1.8 lens for under $190, and it even has autofocus. Is it too good to be true? Let's find out in this review. Kia ora, good morning everyone, Rich Wong here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to have a look at another lens from Meike, and this one is the 85 1.8 lens for the Nikon DSLR cameras. One thing that is quite special about this lens is this is the first lens from Meike that has the autofocus support for the Nikon cameras. And another thing that is also quite interesting is the price. The lens is only $190 US, which is pretty cheap. Even if it doesn't have autofocus for 85 1.8 lens, it is a very good price, and now it has autofocus. So that makes this lens even more interesting. 85 1.8 is a pretty popular choice for people who want to shoot some portrait because the focal length is very suitable, the large aperture 1.8, and also the price is a lot more affordable than the 85 1.4. If you are a Nikon shooter, the Nikon 85 AFS 1.8G lens is quite a popular choice for people who want to shoot some portrait because the image quality is very good and also the price is very affordable. But when I said the price is affordable, it is still around $400 US, the street price, which is still more than double the price of this Meike lens. For me to see whether this Meike 85 1.8 is a good alternative to the Nikon, I went to see my friends at the Auckland Camera Center and borrowed a Nikon 85 1.8G lens so that I can do some comparison between these two lenses. As usual, let's start by talking about the design and build quality of the lens first. And just a disclaimer, Meike sent me this sample for the review, but as usual, you know, I'm going to talk about the pros and cons, things I like and don't like about each of the product that I review. When I first saw the lens, my first impression, I was actually quite surprised because the lens actually looks very nice. It looks quite premium. I wasn't expecting that at all for a lens that is only around $190. The design looks very modern-ish, and it looks actually quite a bit different to the other Meike lens that I have reviewed in the past. However, when I pick up the lens, I do immediately feel the lens actually feels quite plasticky. It actually feels quite hollow if you put your finger, try to knock on the shell of the lens. And also another thing is I noticed the focus ring, there is actually a little bit of play, which is something that I didn't really notice with the other Meike lens. So yeah, it does feel a little bit plasticky and cheap compared to actually the other Meike lens that I have reviewed in the past. But having said that, for a lens that is around $190, I think the build quality is still quite acceptable. The lens has a 67mm filter thread at the front, and then behind that we have the focus ring, which apart from there's a bit of play, overall it actually feels pretty smooth. Probably better than the average autofocus lens in the market, even if you compare to some of the first-party lens. The focus ring actually feels pretty good. However, as a Nikon user, you may notice that the focus ring, the direction is opposite to the normal Nikon first-party lens. When you want to turn to infinity, you actually turning it this way instead of a typical Nikon lens should be the other way. Probably not a very big thing because I would expect most people actually will be using this lens, just use it in the autofocus mode, probably not going to manual focus much. But yeah, that's something I noticed when I was playing with this lens. And then there's the autofocus and manual focus switch on the side. And then if you look at the back, we do have a metal lens mount, so that is pretty good. And we have the electronic contact because the lens has full electronic support. It can control the autofocus and also the auto aperture, and also when you take the photo you have the EXIF data that is recorded in the file. So that is pretty good. And the lens also comes with a lens hood that fits very nicely onto the lens. The lens hood also feels a little bit plasticky. For example, if you compare it with the lens hood for the Nikon 85 1.8, the lens hood for the Nikon definitely feel just much better quality than the one on the Meike lens. Okay, let's mount the lens on the camera and then we can talk about the operation a bit more. Well, first thing I want to say is the lens fits perfectly onto the camera. And this lens, unlike most of the third-party lenses from China, which would rely on the aperture ring, a mechanical aperture ring on the lens for you to change the aperture, this one you don't have to do that. You can just use your camera's dial to change it, and that means not only is electronically controlled, and also means when you stop down the lens, when you look through the viewfinder, you wouldn't immediately stop down the lens. That means you can still see the bright image through the viewfinder, unlike the mechanical lenses that once you stop down, the viewfinder become dimmer and dimmer because the lens already stopped down. And the depth of field preview also works perfectly fine. If you stop down the lens and then you press the depth of field preview, it will stop down the aperture just like a first-party lens. The next thing I want to talk about is the autofocus, because this is the first Meike lens that has autofocus support on the Nikon cameras. I have tried this lens on a couple of different Nikon DSLR, so overall I can say the autofocus indeed it works, but it is a little bit slow and also it is pretty noisy. Let me just try to show you how noisy it is. So you can hear the autofocus motor is definitely pretty loud compared to the average autofocus lens that you can use on the Nikon DSLR cameras. And it seems like, especially in the darker environment, probably because the autofocus need to work harder, you will notice the autofocus noise is pretty loud when you're shooting under a low light condition. On a bright sunny day, it doesn't sound too bad. I think it's just because the autofocus just work a lot easier, and also the autofocus performance is pretty fast on a bright sunny day. But yeah, if you're shooting indoor low light, you would definitely notice the autofocus is pretty loud and also a little bit slower than most other autofocus lenses. However, in terms of the accuracy, it seems to be pretty good. I have shot probably a couple of hundred photos and mostly at f1.8. I don't notice the accuracy is any worse compared to the Nikon 85 1.8G lens. So I guess that's a good thing, because if you are shooting portrait, most of the time a little bit slower autofocus or a little bit louder is probably not a very big issue. The most important thing is the accuracy, because if the lens cannot focus accurately, then it really isn't really useful, especially when you are shooting at 1.8, which has a pretty shallow depth of field. So the good news is the accuracy doesn't seem to be an issue at all with this Meike lens. After I tried this Meike lens on some Nikon DSLRs, the next thing I did is I also mounted on my Nikon Z6 using the FTZ adapter and just see how the performance is like. So there's some good news and bad news. The good news is the autofocus also works quite well on the Z6 using the FTZ adapter. However, the auto aperture or the aperture itself doesn't work quite correctly, and after spending quite a bit of time just go back and forth between the DSLR and the Z6 just trying to figure out what's going on, in the end I come up with the conclusion is, if I mount this Meike lens on a DSLR and then use it, and then I unmount it and then mount it on the Z6 using the FTZ adapter, the first time I do that and the first time I turn on the Z6, the lens works perfectly fine. And what that means is the aperture control is perfectly normal from the camera. I can control the aperture from the camera, and also the aperture would stop down when it should and or stay wide open when it should. So it works perfectly fine. However, If I then turn off the camera and then when I turn on the camera again, the aperture seems to be stuck at around f11 or so, and no matter what I do, the aperture still remains stuck at f11. Even if I try to change the aperture to f1.8 on my Z6, the camera will display is 1.8, but if I take the photo, it will be at around f11 or so instead of f1.8. It doesn't matter if I switch off and switch on the camera or unmount the lens from the camera and put it on again, it still wouldn't fix the problem unless I mount on another Nikon DSLR and turn on, turn off again. If I then mount it back onto my Nikon Z, then it would work perfectly again until I switch off the camera. So I have reported this issue to Meike, and they are looking into that and just trying to see if they can get it fixed or not. One good news though is that the lens actually has a USB port at the back. So there's a USB port here, there's a micro USB port here, and this USB port is for updating the lens firmware. So if Meike managed to get it fixed and make it work perfectly fine on the Nikon Z camera, I would definitely let you guys know. So I would probably just post a comment on this video and then ping it at the top. So check out my video comment when you are watching this video to see whether Meike has got a new firmware that make it compatible on the Nikon Z camera or not. And just let me clarify again, the issue that I just talked about is only if you try to mount this lens on a Nikon Z camera. If you just want to use it on a Nikon DSLR, then you wouldn't have any of this issue at all, even with the firmware that I'm currently shooting with. Okay, now let's have a look at the image sharpness. And because of the issue I talked about before, so I have to dig out my Nikon D800 to do this image sharpness test. I haven't used my D800 for quite a while actually. So anyway, if you look at the center sharpness at the maximum aperture f1.8, even look at the 36 megapixel photo, the center sharpness is actually already very good. There is a bit of chromatic aberration, but apart from that, the image quality at the center at f1.8 is very good. Stop down the Meike to f2.8 and it will remove most of the chromatic aberration and also improve the sharpness even more. So the center image quality at f2.8 is excellent. If you compare it with the Nikon, the center sharpness is actually very similar at the same aperture. And at some of the aperture, I may even say the Meike is slightly sharper than the Nikon, but the difference is actually very small. So if you are taking real world photo, it's probably not even noticeable. Okay, now let's look at the corner sharpness. At f1.8, the Meike is a little bit soft and you can also see a bit of chromatic aberration. Stop down to f2.8, the corner sharpness will improve quite a bit and also it removes a lot of the chromatic aberration. By the time you stop down to f4, then the corner sharpness of the Meike lens becomes very good. If I compare the results with the Nikon, I think at f1.8 to f2.8, the Nikon is a bit sharper compared to the Meike, and also the Nikon has a bit less chromatic aberration. But once I stop down to f4, then the corner image quality from these two lenses is virtually the same. I just talked a little bit about the chromatic aberration, and now let's look at these two sample photos. Both of them were shot at f1.8. If you zoom into the photo, you would see that the Meike again does have a little bit more chromatic aberration if you compare it with the Nikon. But to be fair, I think the amount of chromatic aberration is pretty acceptable for a 85 1.8 lens at the maximum aperture. As a portrait lens, the quality of the bokeh is very important, and I think some people might even say the bokeh is more important than the image sharpness or other image quality for a portrait lens. And with the Meike at the maximum aperture, I say the bokeh is beautiful. The bokeh is very round and also it's very smooth and doesn't look nervous at all. And when you stop down the lens, the bokeh still remain relatively round and also relatively smooth. The bokeh from the Nikon is also very nice and very smooth. But when I compare the photos from the Nikon and the Meike, put them side by side, I do notice there is a little bit more cat's eyes effect from the Nikon compared to the Meike. So at the maximum aperture, I would say the bokeh from the Meike looks a little bit better than the Nikon. One interesting thing I noticed when I was comparing the bokeh sample photos from these two lenses is, even though all the sample photos were shot with the camera at the same position and also focus on the same focus distance, when I start to stop down the lens, the bokeh balls in the photos from the Meike lens is a bit smaller than the bokeh balls from the Nikon, even shot at the same aperture. For some reason, all the photos I shot at f2.8, f4, f5.6, etc. they all have the same behavior. So not too sure why, but that's something I found quite interesting. Both lenses have very small amount of distortion. Even when I look at my brick wall test photos, the photos that I shot using either of these lenses, there is virtually no distortion that I can see in the sample photo at all. Another slightly interesting thing I noticed when I was comparing the brick wall photo is the Meike has a slightly narrower angle of view when you compare it with the Nikon. So that doesn't mean one is better than the other, but it's just something I noticed when I was testing the photos and I thought I should share with you guys. At the maximum aperture f1.8, the Meike already has very small amount of vignetting, which actually surprised me quite a bit. And when I stop down to f2.8, then vignetting is not really noticeable at all with this Meike lens. The Nikon in comparison definitely has more noticeable vignetting. If you put the f1.8 photos side by side, you can easily see the Nikon has more vignetting. And even when you stop down the lens at the same aperture, the Nikon still has more vignetting than the Meike lens. If there is one major weakness with this Meike lens, I think it would be the lens flare. It's quite easy to get quite a bit of lens flare when you are shooting with this 85 1.8 Meike lens. This would make it a bit tricky if you like to shoot some portrait photo with strong backlight, which is something I usually quite like to do. Fortunately, the lens does have a lens hood which could help reduce the amount of lens flare or reduce the chance of having lens flare. But if you have a light source that is inside the frame, then quite often you would have quite a bit of lens flare, and also the contrast of the photo would drop quite a bit. What makes it worse is some of the photos I can see a bit of haze while there's no strong light source in front of the lens. So this is definitely one thing that you have to be careful when you are taking photo with this Meike lens. Okay, so how is this Meike 85 1.8 lens? Is it a good value for money lens, or is it something that you should just try to avoid and get the Nikon instead? I think I have just presented all the comparison to you, so you should be able to answer it yourself. But if you want to hear my opinion, I would say there are two things the Meike definitely can't compete with the Nikon. The first thing is the autofocus. The autofocus with the Meike is a lot louder and also not quite as smooth or as fast as the Nikon. So if you need to take some photo in a very quiet place, then the Nikon would be the much better choice for you. And the second thing is lens flare. The Meike is a lot easier to have lens flare compared to the Nikon. So that's something that you really have to be careful if you are shooting photos, portrait photos with this Meike, especially when there's strong backlight. But apart from that, I'm actually pretty surprised by this Meike lens because the price is only $190. So that's a very cheap price for a 85 1.8 portrait lens with autofocus. And if you look at the image quality, the sharpness is pretty much just as good as the Nikon. The bokeh is beautiful, there is not much distortion at all, and also the vignetting is very well controlled. So overall, I think the two things that I just mentioned, the autofocus and lens flare, are the biggest reason for you to decide whether you should get this Meike lens or not. If you can live with these limitations, then the Meike lens is definitely a very good value for money lens, and I really hope that they can update the firmware and make it also usable on the Nikon Z cameras, because if they done that, then this lens would also be a pretty good and very affordable portrait lens choice for the Nikon Z camera users.